This watch mechanism belonged to this man. His name was Wilfred Dunderdale, and for decades he was arguably the most successful and certainly the most colourful spy working for British intelligence. Now Wilfred, or Biffy as he was called by his colleagues, was a good friend of this man, and this man is Ian Fleming, who was the British author who created a character for a series of novels called James Bond.
Biffy met Ian Fleming in Paris in 1939. There is no evidence that he knew him before that. They maintained a relationship quite easy because Fleming was working for Admiral Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence.
This is Tim Spicer. Now Tim is the author of the definitive book on Biffy Dunderdale, and for reasons you may already know, and if you don't they'll soon become apparent, there's probably no other man alive with a set of credentials better than Colonel Tim to write this book. Now, for reasons you'll learn in this video, it's clear that Fleming based a significant amount of what ended up as James Bond on the real-life spy Commander Dunderdale. So I am going to repair and service the real commander's real timepiece, which was purchased by Tim Spicer recently at auction. But why did Colonel Tim ask me to do the work? Well, Colonel Tim is my old boss.
Yeah, and he was a very astute and intelligent man, and he would have been interested. So Biffy's early life in Odessa. He was born in 1899. His father was an entrepreneur. Biffy's mother was an Austro-Hungarian countess. He spoke English, Russian, French, German, Polish, and probably a smattering of other things. He came from a sort of multilingual household.
So I guess the lesson to learn here is that if you want to be a spy, then go and learn some languages. In fact, go and learn about 5 of them and make sure that they are the languages that are going to be important to the next big war. Now, this mechanism that I'm working on, the one that Colonel Tim bought recently at auction, it's a really high quality movement, but when I got it, it wouldn't wind and you couldn't set the time on it. And that was because the crown wheel was completely trashed.
There is an apocryphal story that he earned it boxing later in the Royal Navy, but that's not true. He learnt to fight in the waterfront bars of Odessa, and that's where he got his nickname Biffy. So you have this young man growing up in a multicultural, multinational, quite tricky place to live, Odessa, finding his feet, highly educated, highly intelligent, multilingual. He was hired during the Russian Civil War by the Royal Navy, really by naval intelligence, to act as an interpreter in the first instance. But he quickly sort of proved that he was a bit more than just an interpreter. He could use his connections, what would be called in intelligence parlance, networks, and he was entrusted very quickly with producing intelligence reports, all of which are preserved in the National Archive, and they're very, very detailed. For somebody who had no intelligence or military training, they're particularly good.
As was the highly skillful removal of that cannon pinion, although I say so myself, what shouldn't. However, what is less good and what is going to give us a pretty major problem is what is on the other side of this crown wheel. So I'm just going to turn this over now. And there it is. It's missing rather a lot of teeth. They've literally just been snapped off. So that is never going to work again. And the less than good news is that there are no spares for this caliber.
And there is evidence in my book that he advised Fleming just before Biffy retired about aspects of From Russia with Love. It takes place on a train, it involves a coding machine, and there are many, many references in the book that are pure Biffy. As to what Fleming got from Biffy. I think there are aspects of the character of Bond, certainly, and the sort of periphery lifestyle and things like that. But Biffy's main use to Fleming was recounting exploits and details of tradecraft and that sort of thing, and possibly operations. Although Biffy was those that met him were quite clear that he would never talk about his intelligence work in any detail. But I think because Fleming had been an intelligence officer himself and knew what the game was, Biffy was a little bit more open with him. But I think not specifically operational detail, but possibly operational methodology. The sort of proof of this relationship is an inscription in a copy of Diamonds Are Forever saying to Bill, "Thank you for your help with the next one." And the next one is from Russia with Love. And that's the one that is full of Biffy-isms.
The palette fork is a small and delicate component, so we have to be a little bit careful whilst we're doing this. Just come into the palette fork now. There it is. For the watchmakers, this bridge comes off best with a purple size screwdriver. Now Omega have done something really quite clever with the keyless works on this caliber, because they're using two sprung components where most manufacturers would use about 5 or 6. The downside of that is that I am not familiar with it, and it is loaded with tension, so we have to proceed a little bit cautiously here because we don't want stuff to fly across the workshop. So just putting my finger on there now as I release. Nah, not happy with that. So if in doubt, put a very large piece of Rodico over everything that can potentially fly off. And although, the whole of the canteen at Omega would be laughing at this, it is the safest way to proceed. So just gently now levering it up, and there it is there. So that is pretty much the entire keyless works lifted off with one lump of Rodico. Not done that before. So take the sliding pinion off and the clutch.
But Tom Green was told by Biffy, go and scout the train and see if there are any German agents, known enemy on the train. And he came back and said, nobody we recognise. But your neighbour, Sacha Guitry, the French playwright, who was quite flamboyant and quite a character, with many of his wives and girlfriends, was a neighbour of Biffy's. And Tom Green came back and said, no Germans, but your neighbour's here. And Biffy, quick as a flash, thought, aha, I now know how we're going to get the Enigma disguised to England.
And before I let Colonel Tim finish this story, can we just dwell for a moment on these two mainspring barrels, because these are utterly astonishing. They're in such good condition that I'm really not going to touch these. I'm just going to put them in the ultrasonic cleaner as they are, and I am very confident that these will drive the mechanism pretty much as they did when they first came off the production line in 1937.
Aha, I now know how we're going to get the Enigma disguised to England. So he went up the train to Guitry's compartment and said, words to the effect of, I know your luggage is stashed full of contraband, like cognac and scent for your wife or girlfriend or mistress or whatever. I'll do a deal with you. You hide this box of mine in amongst your Louis Vuitton cases, and we will ensure that you pass through customs in Dover unmolested. And that was the deal. And they hid it, recovered it in Dover, got on the train and arrived at Victoria Station at 6:03, 1803 that evening, where they were met by Stuart Menzies, the head of SIS, and the head of the Government Code and Cipher School, and Biffy handed over the Enigma. And that's how we got it.
In 1920, Dunderdale is just 20 years old, and in an area of the world where the Russian Imperial forces, the Russian White Army, are at war with the new authority in Moscow, the Bolsheviks. Dunderdale is now old enough to get involved, and when he does, his actions involve a submarine. So in pretty much any submarine that has ever put to sea, you'll be able to find, tucked in a corner somewhere, one of these. Now, this is a little engineering lathe for the making of parts that are broken. Now, as a watchmaker, this is my biggest lathe, and I'm using it here to finish off one of the cases for my bronze Seawolf watch. Fortunately, the profile of the crown wheel on Biffy's clock is really too complex for me to make a new one on this lathe. So, to solve this problem, we're going to have to find a donor clock. Okay, we are coming up to 1 minute to go on this auction. We are currently winning it at £650 bid, although we have the highest actual bid at 475, but we don't know what is out there. So at 40 seconds, I'm going in with the absolute highest of 1600, which should send, there we go, bid that. That should send alarm and despondency into the enemy camp.
There was an Imperial Navy submarine called the Utka, which had a standard crew on it, but it contained a Bolshevik revolutionary cell. And Biffy found out that when it next put to sea, to take over the ship and throw the officers and anybody else in their way over the side. So he warned both the British Navy and the White Russian military hierarchy, and went on board himself for the voyage, and rather euphemistically put, dealt with the mutineers and put the mutiny down, for which he was awarded the MBE.
So 9 seconds to go. Let's have a look at this. I think we just won this. We're determining the winner. That is weird. Please refresh the page. Okay. You won this auction. Oh, excellent. This is exciting because the clock has arrived. So let's get this open and have a look. Okay, it seems to wind properly, so that's good. And it goes, which is good too. So I'm going to move quite rapidly through how we harvest the component that we're after, which is the crown wheel, because we've seen all this before pretty much in the disassembly of your own clock. So just taking off the hands. Releasing the movement. The setting lever screw so that we can take out the stem. Releasing the dial screws. Taking off the minute wheel and dial washers. Disarming the watch, letting down the mainspring. And removing the crown wheel retention plate. Let's take out the second screw there. Now we're nearly to where we want to be. So this next component, this is the one we're after. When I can get hold of it. And just looking underneath to make sure that it is good. And even now I can see that's good. But let's have a close-up. The one on the left is the original one, and you can see the teeth missing down at the sort of between 6 and 7 o'clock. And the one on the right is looking good. What is the significance of the demonstrably nubile lady in the photograph at the back there?
Oh, that's Josephine Baker, who, as I'm sure people know, was a rather exotic cabaret dancer in Paris in the 20s and 30s. She and Biffy were friends. In exactly what capacity I wouldn't like to comment, but they were friends.
And whilst we're on the subject of exotic beauty and style, why don't we just add a little bit of functionality and resilience to that and take a look at this? Because this is the watch that I make under my own brand, Major, which was my rank when I left the British Army, and it's called the Seawolf, and isn't it pretty? For more information, just click the link in the description.
Yeah, Sterling Coast Guard listing out channel 16.
Now the watch has been through the ultrasonic cleaner, and as you can see it is absolutely gleaming. So I'm going to start putting this back together whilst I leave Colonel Tim to tell us more about the women in Biffy's life.
She and Biffy were friends. In exactly what capacity I wouldn't like to comment, but they were friends. And much later, in the run-up to the Second World War, Josephine Baker was recruited by the Deuxième Bureau to be an agent, and Biffy was certainly cognizant of it and was contacted by Vichy and warned that she was working for them. Women loved Biffy and he loved women, but the sort of main ladies that feature in his life are his first wife June, who was a very young, wealthy American who he met in Paris and married, and that lasted until just about the end of the Second World War, although I think they had grown apart quite rapidly. There was quite a significant age gap. In fact, they were underage when they got married. And the marriage, rather than ending in divorce, was annulled because they were married in Paris. So the law was different. They could annul it. And that was the end of it. His second wife had been married to a fellow SIS officer, or maybe an MI5 officer, and they were divorced, and Biffy lived with her until she died, sadly. And his third wife was an American widow who he lived with in New York, and occasionally they'd come back to the United Kingdom. But he had other ladies in his life. He was very friendly with both the grey and green wives, but in a platonic sense.
Okay, so just testing the keyless works now. We're in the winding position, as you can see, so we would pull them out, and you could see the sliding pinion here move forward, and that will engage with the crown wheel to turn the motion works, and then push it back in. Now pushing it back in is pretty tough on this. There you go. I don't like the way that's working at the moment. It feels like it needs more heavy grease in there. So just going to put on some reassuringly expensive grease now. So this will hopefully make the operation of the keyless works a little smoother. Okay.
The Safe with Two Doors and the Rolls Royce, both stories that centre around his time in Paris. The Safe with Two Doors is completely untrue. It's a great story, but it's not true. And the story is that when the Poles sent two Enigma machines to Paris, one for the French and one for the British, Biffy put them in his safe initially, supposedly the safe that had a front door and a concealed door but at the back of the safe, which was in a different room, for which only Biffy had the key. And the story is that he pinched both Enigma machines, both ours and the French one. Completely untrue. The French took their machine. As it arrived actually in a Polish diplomatic bag, it was delivered to the French government, not to Biffy, and the French gave Biffy our Enigma, the British Enigma, and kept their own. So unfortunately that story is not true. It's quite an amusing story, but it's just not true.
And the fourth wheel, this train actually has 6 wheels including the escape wheel, which is one more wheel more than normal. So just gently putting on the top plate now. Okay, now we have to wiggle the pivots until they all go in. This takes a little bit of time to do. So once all the pinions are in and located, we just have to secure down the top plate. That's done with these 3 screws, just cleaning that up now. And then having done that, we need to make sure that all the pivots are free and operating as they should. So there's just looking cross-sectionally down the movement just to check everything's working nicely, and it is. That's good.
The story about Biffy's Rolls-Royce: he had his own private Rolls-Royce, but became friendly with the Rolls-Royce distributing agent in Paris, one Walter Sleater, and Biffy said, look, I quite like to, in the event of hostilities, get my Rolls-Royce out of France, because this was, there were war clouds on the horizon. And Sleater said, well look, we have a depot at Biarritz where we can take your own Rolls-Royce now, and we can ship it back to England. And I will lend you, for operational duties, a Rolls-Royce, an official car, for which Biffy said, thank you very much. Sleater then became part of Biffy's network, both in Paris and subsequently in the war. Biffy's car went to Biarritz, unfortunately didn't make it back to England. I think the Germans grabbed it, confiscated it, and used it themselves, and it disappeared.
You'll see that I'm doing it a little bit heavy in some of these teeth. That's deliberate, because as this turns, this will spread itself out evenly. Replacing the crown wheel retention plate. Tighten those screws up. That's good. And back with some reassuringly expensive grease to put the cannon pinion on. In fact, this Mobius grease is designed specifically for cannon pinions. A little bit of lighter lubrication for the minute wheel, and a little bit on that ridge where it rests. Pop on the minute wheel. And popping on the minute wheel guard.
Sheila Green just said to her father and to Biffy in 1940, when they were going to be evacuated, I think I will stay here. I will stay in Paris and help you set up a network. Which is incredibly brave of her, but actually not as foolhardy as you might think. She was an Irish citizen, she had an Irish passport, she was a neutral. Tom Green was an Irishman and had property in Paris and in the south of France. So she took herself off to their villa, I think it's in Nice, where she established contact again with one Philip Coon, who was the son of George Coon, who was one of Biffy's father's friends. So sort of family relationships quite important in this setting up of clandestine networks. And together they set up what became a network called Jade Amicol.
Putting the click spring in, just protecting the main plate with some plastic there, because you have to push quite hard on that. and then putting the click itself in. So now on the other side of the movement, putting in the fifth wheel and the escape wheel now.
And together they set up what became a network called Jade Amicol, which was one of the most successful intelligence gathering networks in occupied France throughout the war, and survived. It absorbed a couple of hits from the Gestapo, but largely went through the war until 1944, gathering strategic intelligence and sending it back to London.
Can you tell me about the story of the regimental goat?
Not one of Biffy's greatest moments, the regimental goat of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers traditionally have a mascot, which is a goat, and it's either presented to them by the monarch or, in the case of overseas deployment, and bear in mind this was just after the First World War, local purchase. The goat was on parade, which it normally is. Biffy was invited as a guest, and he donned his full dress naval uniform. Bear in mind he was using the Navy as a cover. And at the end of the parade he jumped into his car, thought he'd put it in forward gear, first gear, but in fact it was in reverse, and reversed over the goat and killed it. And as a result, it upset him so much, not only the embarrassment of killing the regimental goat on parade, but also the fact he'd run over somebody's animal, he vowed never to drive again.
In with the pallet fork. Extreme care is needed with this. The pivot is about the diameter of a human hair, so it's really easy to break if you mess this up. So just carefully putting the bridge on now, and just seating it before tightening it up. If you tighten it up without it seated properly, it is extremely easy to snap the pivot, and then we're in a world of hurt, really.
Was he the role model for James Bond? Not really, but he was part of it. He doesn't look like James Bond as described by Ian Fleming. He was never an assassin or a person that removed the king or queen's enemies, which Bond was more that than he was an intelligence officer. He didn't recruit agents per se or run networks. He went out and removed the enemy.
Okay, put the balance back on and winding the watch now. Winds nicely now, no problem. A little shake and off she goes. And what's quite nice is watching this balance pick up some amplitude. It's a little bit of inertia as it starts, but once it's going well. So on with the hour wheel now, and there's actually used two dial washers here, two foils on here. That's what it came with, so that's what I've done. I'm putting on the dial. Just lining it up and placing it on, and it just fits exactly, which is kind of what you'd expect from Omega. And securing it down with the three dial retention screws, placing on the hour hand and the minute hand. And just checking the operation again of the keyless works. Placing on the subdial hand or the second hand, giving it a little shake. Once it's on, start the movement, and there we go, we have a working clock, which is nice.
If you make of all this, he'd probably be horrified. I think he was flamboyant, and he didn't dislike publicity or being seen and known about in public, but he was very conscious of what was to be kept secret. There are lots of photographs of him later in life. I suspect, when I said he'd be horrified that I was able to unearth some intelligence material, but he would probably like the overall concept of having a book about it.